Welcome everybody to this meeting of the Governance and Audit Committee. It's the afternoon of Monday the 13th of November and this is a hybrid meeting, so some people are present with me in the Council chamber and obviously some people are online. I will start by making the usual announcements which cover the fact that this meeting will be recorded. Mobile phones should be switched to silent, and people can either raise their physical or virtual hand if they wish to ask questions. I then have a second announcement I'd like to make, and it's with great sadness that I want to inform the committee members and officers present of the sad death of our colleague, Councillor Marcia Spooner, who unfortunately passed away earlier this month. I'm going to ask that we have a minute's silence, and rather than everybody stand to do so, which would be the case if we were all present, I'm going to ask that people remain seated. So we're going to be silent for 1 minute. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We'll now resume the meeting, but it's a great pity that Councillor Spooner, who had been part of this committee since the start of this particular length of life of the council, is no longer with us. She would be greatly missed. We then have the next item on the agenda is the question of declarations of interest. I would like to make one declaration for myself. It's a non-prejudicial declaration. It relates to page 180 and it relates to the productive relationships with third sector. I'm involved with the charity that has benefited from part of the financial situation. So I'll complete the relevant documentation in due course. Does anybody else have any other declarations?
I see no indications, Chair. Oh, hang on. We've got Helen Griffiths, Vice Chair.
Helen, as Vice Chair, do you want to make a declaration?
Yes, it's in regards to the Tata Steel reference in item 7 in the strategic risk register. I am a employee of Tata Steel.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll note that. Obviously, when we get to that point, you will withdraw yourself from any particular conversations. Thank you very much indeed. Any other declarations?
I see no further indications, Chair.
Thank you. So moving on to the third item on the agenda, it's the minutes of the previous meeting, which run from pages 3 to 14. I don't know if anyone wants to raise any particular points with regard to those minutes from an accuracy point of view. I know there were some actions that came out of that particular set of minutes, and my understanding is that all those actions have been completed. So does anyone want to raise any points?
Chair, I see no indications from anyone.
Thank you. In which case, if I might have a proposer and seconder for the minutes, please. Councillor Rogers, I can see you indicating, and sorry, Councillor Carpenter, I can see you indicating. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, Councillor.
My apologies, Chair. Happy to propose.
So may I have a seconder from somebody who was in the meeting? I can see some faces on the screen who were present. Councillor Richards.
I'll second, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. In which case, those minutes are approved and are an accurate record. The next item on the agenda item 4, is the detailed audit plan for 2023, which is going to be introduced by officers, and then I believe Audit Wales are going to speak to the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This item is the Audit Wales report detailing the findings from the audit of the statement of accounts that we presented to the committee as draft stage in June, and they will be presented by a member of the Audit Wales team who will be able to give you more information on them.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chair. Shall I come in there? Good morning, members. Good afternoon rather.
Good afternoon to you. Yes, please. Thank you.
Lovely to join this afternoon. I know I met some of you on the screen when we provided some training to the Governance and Audit Committee about a month ago. So it's lovely to join you and see many of you again today. And I'm joined by my colleague Gillian, who will be far more familiar to you. I'll briefly take you through the audit plan, and then Gillian will take you through the next item on the agenda once we refer back to you, Chair, if that's okay. But as mentioned, we're sharing with you the audit plan that sets out our planned programme of work for the year before you today. And I think it's fair to say it's probably somewhat later than we originally envisaged. The plan was originally shared with the Council back in June. So, as I say, it's somewhat later than we originally anticipated sharing this with you. And it's probably quite unusual that we're presenting an audit plan at the same time that you'll be considering the outcome of the financial audit work and the item that follows on the agenda. But the plan sets out the Auditor General's key responsibilities, a planned programme of work for the year, covering both our financial audit and performance audit work. And it also contains other details, such as details of the team and the audit fee, and I'll briefly touch on those in a second, Chair. And the important thing I think to flag is this is the first plan that's been prepared under a revised auditing standard. And as set out in Appendix 1 to the audit plan, it's had quite a significant impact in terms of how we undertake our financial statements work. And as I say, the outcome of that is on the agenda later today. But I'd gladly take any questions at the end, Chair, in terms of any of those changes. And that's an industry-wide change that's been imposed on us. And that has had quite a big impact really in terms of how we've conducted our audit and how we document it. And probably the other key change is the actual skill mix on the audit. It requires a slightly richer skill mix at different stages of the audit, and that's impacted on the audit fee, which I'll touch on briefly. Just turning to the significant financial statement risks, and you can see on page 26 of your agenda pack today, there's one significant financial statement risk that we identified at the planning stage, and that was the management override of controls, and that risk is present in all entities. And what we do in response to that, you can see in Exhibit 1 there, we identify a number of audit procedures to enable us to assess, for example, the design and implementation of controls around journals, so a key aspect of the accounts preparation process, a key control. We also look at those journal entries to make sure they're appropriate and they're supported, and also look at any other key adjustments to the financial statements. We also look at key estimates and also the rationale for any significant transactions that may be outside the normal course of business, and we'll report on the outcome of that shortly to you in the next item. We also identified in Exhibit 2 other areas of key focus for us this year in auditing your financial statements, and you can see there 2 key estimates really contained within those financial statements. One being the valuation of the pension fund liability, so some big figures there. So again, we look at some of the assumptions that the actuaries made there and how management and officers have used that information. And another key estimate around the valuation of land and buildings, especially in the context at the moment, the current economic climate with inflation rates. What impact is that having on any assets that weren't necessarily revalued in year, just to ensure that they're appropriately and materially reflected within the balance sheet of the council. Just turning on to page, just bear with me for a second while I scroll through to page 30 of the audit plan there, and you can see the planned work that we plan to undertake under our performance audit work, so looking at your value for money arrangements, And there's a piece of work there around your assurance and risk assessment that looks at the arrangements to secure value for money, but also 2 other areas of work that we were looking to complete around financial sustainability, clearly a big issue for a number of local authorities and the wider public sector, given the financial challenges that present themselves at the moment, and also looking at your procurement and contract management arrangements as well, and the importance of that, especially in the current economic climate. If I just maybe draw the committee's attention to just a couple of other key aspects of the audit plan. On page 32 of your agenda pack there, you can see that the audit fee and details of the audit team are set out there. And what that audit fee reflects really is the impact, or our assessment of the impact of the revised standard. As I mentioned earlier, an increased skill mix, or richer skill mix there, and you can see the impact that's had on the fee. So our fee rates increased by 4.8% due to inflation, so slightly lower than inflation figures at the time. But also we've also reflected a 10.2% increase for our financial audit work, and that's our assessment of the impact of the revised standard, and that's been applied across all sectors that we audit this year. So you can see the details of the fee set out there in Exhibit 5. And just finally, in Exhibit 6, you can see the details of the audit team there, and I can confirm that the team members are all independent of the council and your officers, and no independence issues have arisen since then. I'll pause there, Chair, but happy to take any questions on any aspects of the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any particular questions. I noted when I read these papers, and it's also the same with regard to some of the other parts of the papers, there are still some acronyms creeping in. I know that there are glossaries in other parts of the papers where, because the acronym isn't actually highlighted, when you try to search for it, it's very difficult to then work out exactly what it was. So it's a plea from me as chair to make it easier for people who don't deal with, for example, on page 31, NDR, non-domestic rates is what I now know it means, but it would greatly assist if acronyms were removed from the outset.
Sure.
So if anyone has any other questions, perhaps they could please raise their hands. Thank you. I can see no other comments that anyone wants to make at this point. I should say, however, that I note that one of my lay colleagues has joined the meeting a slight amount of time ago, and therefore perhaps Mark Owen, could we just cover the point of declaration of interest in your respect, please?
Yes, Chair. No declarations for me.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. So I don't think there are any questions for you, Mr. Edwards, at the moment. Obviously, it's interesting that changes are making greater calls on everybody's skills. We as a committee have been speaking recently, and we will speak later in the meeting about the fact that we need to address some of our understandings, so some of our skills as well. But yes, it's an interesting report. So so Gillian Gillette, maybe you'd like to come in and cover some of the other points, please.
Thank you, Chair. The next item on the agenda then, agenda item 5, is our audit of accounts report, our ISA 260 report, which summarises the main findings from our audit of your 22-23 financial statements. So it's a positive report, and the Auditor General intends to give an unqualified opinion. So I'd just like to express thanks to the accounts team. We've continued to work with them during the year, and they've been very helpful in supporting us and providing us with the audit evidence we've needed to complete our work.
Can I just interject that just we need to go back to the previous item. I was wondering whether you wanted to add anything to what your colleague had said.
Oh, right, sorry.
Yeah, apologies, because otherwise we need to close off that particular item. So do you want to add anything to what your colleague said?
No, thank you, Chair.
There we are. Thank you. In which case, if there are no questions, this is for information, and therefore the report is for noting. So we will duly note the report. So, and therefore now we'll move on to audit Wales, the audit of accounts for 2022-2023 at pages 39 onwards. And this is the one that obviously you just started speaking about. So thank you. If we can continue that conversation now.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So it's a positive report. I'd just like to note that we received the draft accounts at the end of May. We've now completed our audit work, but in accordance with auditing standards, we are required to bring some matters to your attention before you approve the financial statements. Paragraph 9 then just sets out again that we intend to issue an unqualified opinion once we've received the letter of representation, which is set out in Appendix 1 for you, and the proposed audit opinion is in Appendix 2. As I say, it's unqualified and reflects very well on the finance team and the council. And in paragraph 11, we note that there are no uncorrected misstatements in the accounts. And paragraph 12 then highlights that there were some misstatements in the draft accounts which have been corrected in the final version that you've got later in the agenda. They were fairly minor in nature, mainly of a presentational issue, and they had no impact on the council's net expenditure position. There are further details in Appendix 3 then for you. So I say it's a positive report and happy to take any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Certainly, it's very pleasing to read that yet again this local authority receives an unqualified report. I've been on this committee for quite a number of years now, and it's always reassuring that that's the situation. I know one of my colleagues has a question to raise, but before I bring them in, does anybody else want to raise any points? Yes. So, Councillor Rogers, I know you wanted to mention something under this agenda item.
Thank you, Chair. Just obviously, I'm not having a little go. I just would like some more information on the summary of the corrections made, just to get an understanding of why they were changed and what in fact happened. Why were they done? I think there are only 4 of them. I think it's on page 54 of the report.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Yeah, the first one is just a misstatement of just internal recharges were just included incorrectly. They're supposed to be netted off, and there were some that hadn't been netted off. So they just overstate gross income and gross expenditure. Has no effect on the bottom line. So that was the first one.
Okay.
It's just the second one then. The 654, that's employee benefits expenditure. Some impairment losses were miscoded into that line. Again, that's just a misclassification, had no impact on the bottom line. And the next one then, the 254, that again is just a misclassification of income being included as fees and charges when it should have been other services income, again having no impact on the bottom line. And just the last one there then was a misdisclosure of a prior year adjustment, a prior year error, which had to be corrected back to what was actually reflected in last year's accounts. So they were just minor disclosure errors really, and misclassifications, but don't have any impact on the bottom line.
That's excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Apologies. There was one point that I wanted to make on page 52. It states partway through that page that inquiring of management, the Governance and Audit Committee and legal advisors about actual and potential litigation and claims is obviously highlighted. And obviously as a Governance and Audit Committee, we need to be confident that we are receiving the routinely receiving reports that would allow us to actually address that and respond appropriately. Perhaps one of the officers would.
Yep, certainly, Chair. Yes, if there was anything that arose during the financial year that required the attention of this committee, obviously I would be bring it back here to a routine meeting of the committee, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And obviously part of the process, part of the audit of accounts is that letters are duly signed and submitted. And I can confirm that my electronic signature is ready to be appended to the paperwork, obviously to join that of the Chief Finance Officer. And that will be done within the time frame, which is this week, if I remember correctly. So anybody else, any points they want to raise on agenda item 5? No, in which case we'll move on to the next agenda item. And this is the audited statement of accounts, which runs from pages 57 to 234. Before I ask officers to introduce it, obviously, again, the point I made earlier about a tiny number of acronyms being included in the paperwork, we will get to the point where no acronyms are there without them being explained in full. So, so thank you, Officer.
Thank you, Chair. This is the annual report that we provide to committee following completion of the audit of the accounts by Audit Wales. The draft accounts were prepared and in line with the legislation. We presented these to Audit Wales on 26th of May for them to commence the audit. And we subsequently brought these drafts to the committee back in June. Again, as Gillian has mentioned, it's pleasing that we're getting an unqualified audit opinion. But in order to do this, we need to get Chair and Section 151 Officer to finalise all of the legislation behind those, which is signing off the accounts, the letter of representation. The few items that Gillian mentioned in the accounts, again, are presentational, and I'm happy that in an organisation this big, there were a limited number again this year. As well as the audited statements, we are also bringing the annual governance statement. This was brought to you back in June as a draft and subsequently approved by Cabinet. We bring these in line with legislation. So you have seen these before, but if there's any questions, happy to take those questions. That's probably it, Chair.
Thank you. I've got one point I wanted to raise, and it's on page 72 under the heading Narrative Report. And there is reference in that to assets held for sale are valued annually, and 6 assets with a value of 1.98 million were valued at the 31st of March 2023. I'd be interested to know the details of those particular 6 assets, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got the details of those. The largest one is 1.8 million, and it's the former Burrows Yard site. Then we've got the Brindillis Avenue depot in Seven Sisters, the Canolfan sheltered housing, land at North, Rhondda South Pit, Glencorrwg, part of the Goethe Cycleway, and land at Hill, Croes, Carmarthen. That's the 6.
Thank you. And they were obviously picked out for valuation for specific reasons. Do we know what the reasons are?
Any assets that are held for sale are valued every year. So these are the ones that we are holding as for sale. So we have to value them in line with the accounting regulations.
And obviously, the details of whether they're still for sale next time the report comes will be given to the committee. So thank you very much indeed. Anybody got any questions? I believe some colleagues might. No further questions? Me
again, sorry. Page 109, please. It's listed as item 20, unusable reserves. There seems to be a sharp increase. Just a little bit of a background to this, if we could, please.
This is in relation to the pension fund. There's 2 entries on this, part of it being in unusable reserves. The other element is in the liabilities. Obviously, the last evaluation was undertaken in 2020. We do them every 3 years with the actuary. Obviously, things have changed since 2020 in that there's mortality rates have changed, inflation, assets that are held have increased. So that's really what has attributed to it.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Does anybody else have any questions? Obviously, there are a number of recommendations attached to this report, and I was going to suggest that we dealt with them instead of 4 separate recommendations. We dealt with them in their entirety, and therefore perhaps I could have somebody to propose the recommendation.
I'm happy to propose, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rogers. And a seconder, I can see your hand up, Councillor Carpenter.
Happy to second, Chair.
There we are, thank you. If members do not indicate to the contrary by raising their hands, I will assume that everyone's in favour of those recommendations. Thank you. Democratic Services Officer has confirmed that that is now approved, and therefore we can move on to agenda item 7, which is the Strategic Risk Register, which runs from pages 235 to 246. And maybe we could have an officer, I don't know whether it's one of the officers online or one of the officers in the chamber who's going to introduce this particular matter. Thank you.
Chair, happy to take the item.
Thank you.
Okay, so the Strategic Risk Register is included in your papers today to enable the Audit and Governance Committee to review and assess the Council's risk management arrangements and discharge the requirements that are set out for this committee in the Local Government Wales Measure 2011 Act. So the register is appended at Appendix 1. This was scrutinised by the Council's Cabinet scrutiny at the meeting of Cabinet last Wednesday, the 8th of November, where there was quite a discussion around some of the risks set out in the register. On the covering report, we have included for the committee an update on updates to the register that have been made since you last saw it. And we've also included an update on risks that have also been added. Chair, so happy to take any questions.
On that specific point, I've noticed that obviously the risks are numbered SR1 onwards, but they then don't tend to tell you exactly what the topic is about. It's a bit complicated then to have to skip to elsewhere in the paperwork to actually identify whether it relates to an issue to do with workforce or that sort of thing. So it would be handy alongside SR1 for it to say, I know it says there's a mentions Cammer Bridge, but further down some of them just say SR3, for example, no changes. So it would be handy if we could have the heading that there's been no change related to. I've also noted that SR13 has been de-escalated, and then when you get to look at the paperwork further on in the reports, that line has been taken out of the spreadsheet. And yet when you go further down, we've got 3 new risks have been added. So SR18 also has been de-escalated, but instead of it being taken out, you've ended up with a new SR18. And in my reckoning, the 3 new should be headed SR19, SR20 and SR21. Because otherwise we've got a mix and match sort of approach to matters that have either been de-escalated or resolved totally. So those were the comments I wanted to make, and I can see one of the officers wants to address that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think those are very valid comments and observations made, Chair. We certainly make sure that there's greater clarity in that cover sheet moving forward so that it's clear to committee members in exactly what the SR1 is, and take on also the point in terms of how they've been numbered. I can see how that could potentially cause a little bit of confusion. So we'll make a note of that and make sure we take that on board for the next time this report comes before yourselves. Diolch.
Thank you. There's quite a lot of information contained within these pages, and it whilst the narrative report at the start is easy to read, it gets more and more complicated by the time you're looking at the spreadsheets and things. And I know that I've been having conversations with officers about how we can address some of these points. And I think we'll shortly have a conversation about some suggestions as how we can address those points. But I don't know whether any members of the committee have any other comments they want to raise at this point.
Yeah, just backing you up, Chair. It is quite difficult to read when you're using a small iPad as this. Perhaps we can look at narrowing some of the columns, you know, so that it's easier to read and you can blow it up a bit bigger. But it is, the writing is quite a bit small and you tend up losing your way a lot of the time when you're trying to read them. Thank you.
And I know whilst we are wanting to ensure that we don't bring large wadges of paper to these meetings, and I know we're all using technology to assist us, it then does get to be extremely complicated, particularly when, you know, the requirement on us as a committee is to be able to say that we are assured that we understand the risks and that the risks are being addressed in the appropriate way. I don't know if this is the point where it would make sense to discuss some of the solutions we can come up with. But Karen, I know that you were party to a conversation we had the other day with some other colleagues as well. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind telling others who weren't in that meeting some of the solutions that are being suggested.
Yes, Chair. Well, when we had our briefing, we did speak about perhaps the committee would welcome a training session or a briefing session on the Council's corporate risk management policy. That's been in place since 2022, and it sets out the framework across the Council for corporate risk management, including roles and responsibilities from corporate directors to members to Cabinet to yourselves as Governance and Audit Committee. So, Chair, perhaps the committee would welcome a brief training session in the new year.
I certainly personally think that not only would we welcome it, but I think it is actually an imperative that we have one as early as possible in the new year. And the session really would need to address looking at where the thought processes have got to, what the council is achieving, what they're recording, but also informing us about how things may change in the future. I know there's been a suggestion that there would be merit in looking at how some other local authorities dealt with these topics, and I think that's very beneficial. And I certainly think that if we could set aside a half day, whether it's a morning or an afternoon session, where officers would come and brief us about things, it would act as a very good baseline for us to build upon. And having done that, and we could have it as a virtual meeting to save everybody risking you know, the bad weather or whatever. If we did that, we could then start looking to identify which of the directorates we may want to hear from first, because, you know, attached to these 20 or 21 risks are a number of individuals' names. I know the Chief Finance Officer's name is attached to a few of them. I know the Andrew Jarrett's name is attached to some, and it would make sense for us then to have briefing sessions where we could ask senior officers to come and to tell us exactly what they know about certain things. So that's certainly my conversations with officers, and I don't know whether colleagues see that as an acceptable suggestion or whether they'd like to expand upon that. Any of the councillors want to make any comments?
Me again then, Chair. As you know, we in the pre-briefing we had quite a long chat on this, and it does make sense if we work our way through each particular directorate, getting a better understanding of the risk within each one. And it seems a lot, but there are only 19 after all. And if we share it between the directorate, we could probably do one each session, so we could really go to town on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rogers. I can see Councillor Anthony Richards' hand is raised as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Can I make a suggestion as well on, I absolutely agree with you, Chair, with what you've just said, but I think it's about also trying to find a way of what we want to get out of that training as well, so that there is a real, focus on what is going to help us. Because there's a number of questions that I want to ask with regards to a lot of this information. But, it's, you trying to go through the report, then you sort of find the answers as you're sort of asking those questions, but then I'm not 100% sure whether or not those are the right things. So it's maybe having like a bit of a suggestion box, or a whereby we can really think about, look, I would like to have some information on this. So I'll try and give you an example. So if we think about risk mitigation, for example. So for risks with updated mitigation plans, I want to sort of ask, how effective have the existing mitigation strategies proven to be? Are there any challenges or uncertainties in implementing the mitigation plans for specific risks? What criteria, and then risk ratings, what criteria are used to assign risk ratings, so low, medium, high, and how often are these ratings reviewed or reassessed? Because I think having clarity on all of that information will just help us either not to ask those questions because we already know that, or those are the types of questions that we should be asking. So it's I know I'm not making myself really clear because I'm trying to think, but it is very complex to try and get through the report. And I think just having a bit of a training needs analysis, what is it that we actually want to get out of this? Because I can often go to some training, people can talk a lot, and yet I'm still none the wiser when I come out of it. So it's about making it really impactful and making it sticky so that we understand that information as well, and what we need to get out of this information, if that makes sense. I know I haven't been very coherent.
It makes perfect sense. I can see one of my lay colleagues, Mark Owen's hand has raised, but certainly what you've just said, Councillor Richards, makes perfect sense to me. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. It's just a question, I think, on format for me as well. If you take ID SR02, for example, and you look at the format, it looks like the inherent risk is high, and the revised field, which I assume is the residual risk, is also high. And I think for me, it's just trying to understand a little more, just slightly to the point that the previous speaker was talking about the extent of the quality of the mitigation, because obviously if your inherent risk is high, your mitigation plan is what it is, and your revised risk goes high, it tends to feel there's more action required. So the kind of assurance actions you're taking need to be kind of quite clear, I think. But the question for me as well is perhaps, and there may be another document that could help, but it's linking it to the risk appetite. So kind of what's your target risk score here? So, are you comfortable that your medium risk is fine for this respective impact? Is there further work to do? I think that for me, when you're looking at the risk register, it's kind of quite key information to be able to determine whether, your corporate management risk policy is appropriate, So I think those are kind of some high level observations without digging into the detail, but certainly for me, there's a lot of words on this risk register. And I think it probably, I think it could do with being a little more concise and insightful. That's my take on it, because you want to very quickly be able to signpost yourself where the key risks are, if the action's effective, and what additional actions required. And that's not coming out to me from this document, if I'm honest.
Thank you. I again agree with every point you've raised. I can see one of the officers in the chamber wants to say something.
Diolch Cadeirydd, thank you, Chair. Yeah, picking up on the valid points already made this afternoon. I think I can still say that I'm relatively new to the authority. It'll be near 4 months now, but this area, strategic risk register, is an area that is down with me for review in terms of our approach and its presentation and our risk appetite within Neath Talbot Council. So I believe having that session with yourselves in early January will certainly feed into that review, so that we can make sure that the strategic risk register presented to yourselves as Governance and Audit Committee is one that will work and will give you the assurances that you need, that we have got the adequate arrangements in place. So we will welcome all that feedback, and I think it'll be a constructive session. I'm sure in January we can take those points on board and work together to ensure that it is a fit for purpose policy as well around our strategic risk.
Thank you. And I know pre-briefing conversations that I've had with officers have been on the basis of an awful lot of information needs to be contained in these documents, but it then needs to be fit for purpose. To actually highlight, as colleagues have just said, highlight the key issues. So when you immediately pick it up, you can see where the key problems are going to be. And it may be it needs to be presented in a more narrative way instead of a spreadsheet way. And maybe to address the points that have just been made by committee colleagues, there would be merit in an email being sent out to committee members saying, specifically looking at this format, you've got all these headings, you've got the risk descriptions, you've got the names of the risk owners, mitigation plans, inherent and revised risks, and all those sort of thing. Which of those topics are ones that we need to explore further, and how we explore them, so that by the time we get the training session, it's not just we're listening to something and potentially getting to a point where we still have further questions. So maybe I can arrange with Democratic Services officers for an email to go out to committee members, but also potentially everybody who attends this meeting, to actually say, right, this is a piece of work. What are the key points each of you would like to address at this point? Because that would inform Karen and others who are going to be pulling together the presentation. So there's quite a lot of work to do, but this is about us doing it collectively, because we need to make sure we're discharging our duty as having appropriately understood the risks that the council's facing, and also being able to say, for example, in the paperwork, there's reference to potentially there being a £48 million gap in funding. Are we confident that the council is able to address that £48 million gap? Because we would be derelict in our duties if we didn't raise the appropriate questions. So I think it's safe to say that everyone's confident that a training session in early 2024 is where we want to go. I think we then need to work out a structure of how we ask senior officers to attend, to speak about their particular directorates and the risks they hold. And how we do that, I think, is a conversation for myself to be having with officers, because it needs to be done in a structured way. So I think that captures all the points I want to make. Is anybody got any further comments? Maybe officers would like to add anything further? No. Karen, no?
Nothing from me, Chair, thank you.
Thank you. And I believe Audit Wales obviously have an understanding of what might be happening in other local authorities. So we actually need to scope that or understand that work or what they see elsewhere, because our understanding and saying we think it works very well in this particular local authority is a good way to go as well. And I know we've got a couple of Audit Wales colleagues with us today, but I know in the pre-briefing I had last week there was a suggestion that officers would be sent some examples of good practice, basically. So right.
Chair, sorry, Chair, do you want me to come in then just respond to that in terms of the Audit Wales approach? As I shared in the plan, one of the areas of focus for our performance work programme is financial sustainability. But again, as I alluded to earlier, really, we're aware that a number of authorities and indeed the wider public sector are facing significant financial challenges. And indeed, part of that work will be providing some sense of commentary and, as you mentioned as well, sharing some benchmarking information where possible and also examples of good practice. Because again, the conversations I'm having with chief executives, Section 151 officers across local government bodies Wales are very consistent in that respect in terms of the magnitude of the challenge that a number of authorities are facing. So yeah, we'll engage with Hugh and his team over the coming months with that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, and I certainly would welcome that, and I can see from Hugh's nodding that he too would welcome that. So so this particular agenda item is for noting, and unless anyone else has anything to say, I suggest that we note the contents of the report, and we will be able to certainly by March of next year, by the time we've had another 2 meetings, we'll have made significant progress, I'm sure. So thank you very much indeed. The next item, which is agenda item 8, is at pages 247 to 248. It sets out the forward work programme, and this is, as it stands, is what is likely to currently going to be discussed in the next 2 meetings. The documents for noting and the list of items that will be discussed will be added to closer to the time. Does anyone have any comments or questions? No. Thank you. I see no hands, in which case we note that particular document. The next item, which is marked urgent items, it's agenda item 9. And that's one document that's going to be brought, or we're going to discuss, which is the draft self-assessment document for 2022-2023. And I'd like officers to introduce the report. And the report takes us to agenda item 10 in the pack, I think.
Thank you, Chair. Can I first of all apologise? When we first published the ModGov documents for today, we didn't realise there was an issue with the opening of this agenda item, so apologies. It was resent on Friday for today's meeting. So just as a recap, Chair, it's been a year since the committee saw our last self-assessment. So just as a recap for you, so the legislation that covers the requirement for local authorities to undertake a self-assessment is the Local Government Elections Wales Act. So in that legislation, Section 91 states that a draft of the self-assessment should be made available to the Governance and Audit Committee, who then, following a review, can make recommendations for changes to the conclusions in the self-assessment, and those recommendations then would be considered by Cabinet when the draft self-assessment is presented there towards the end of the month. So that's just a little recap on the reason why we undertake a self-assessment. This is the second one, as I just said. And just to explain a little bit more about what the self-assessment is, the legislation asks for local authorities in Wales to keep performance under review. So that's basically what this self-assessment is. In the legislation, there are 3 prompts in there to help guide us about how we undertake the self-assessment. And those 3 prompts are that when undertaking the self-assessment, the council must keep under review the extent to which it's exercising its functions effectively, the extent to which it's using its resources efficiently, economically and effectively, and the extent to which our governance is effective. So that's what the self-assessment is framed around. So as I mentioned earlier, this is our second self-assessment, and we have again for the second year adopted the Local Government Association Efficiency Toolkit as the model to frame our self-assessment. Both the legislation and the associated statutory guidance were non-prescriptive on how local authorities undertake a self-assessment. So you've got 22 local authorities in Wales undertaking it in quite different ways. But what we were keen here to do at Neath Talbot was to adopt a model so that we can use it year on year to help us demonstrate improvement. And our first self-assessment gave us that baseline for 21-22. Chair, if I can take members through very briefly through the report. I'm using the page numbers, your ModGov page numbers, so they're the page numbers on the left-hand side. So on page 9, you can see on the left-hand side our approach that we undertook to complete the self-assessment, those 4 steps. And page 10 includes quite a bit of information on the sources of evidence that we also used to inform the self-assessment. Pages 11 to 19 provide you with an update on the progress made on the actions that we identified when we undertook the 21-22 self-assessment. So quite a bit of work has been progressed over the last year. And on page 20, we've included a summary of our progress against our wellbeing objectives. The key page is page 22. So on page 22, you'll find an overall assessment that we made against the 8 core activity areas that are included in the Local Government Association Toolkit. And you will see that we have scored mature again as we did in 21-22. So whilst the rating remains the same, it is felt progress has been made across those 8 core activity areas, and that we do feel it will take some time for all those core activity areas to move into lead-in. Finally then, on pages 22 and 39, between pages 22 and 39, you've got the critiques that were completed by senior officers against each of those 8 core activity areas. And then finally, pages 40 to 50, you'll see the actions that we've identified following this self-assessment that are currently being implemented. Chair, that's a brief summary of the document in front of you today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. A couple of observations from me. It's a very well put together document. The difficulty, again, it's not easy to read on a screen. I don't want it to be printed out particularly, but the fact that it's almost as if it's you know, every page you look at is in 2 parts. It is not easy to understand all the detail. I also note that in certain parts of it, there obviously the summary performance, for example, gives dates attached to a lot of the actions, and some of them are completed, some of them are ongoing, and some of them have not been completed. I'm just interested why some of them have got dates attached to them and others don't.
Chair, could you give me a page number, Chair, as I flick through the document?
Page 16, I think, is one
Page
of them.
16. Thank you, Chair.
Because you start the document on page, well, looking at page 14, for example, you've got digital data and technology achieved by, they've got a date of March 2023, and then further down, you've just got, it says ongoing. It's just about understanding exactly why it's been laid out in different ways as you go through the document, I think.
Chair, I will have to check back with our Chief Digital Officer, but I think these are longer term actions that would not have been completed within the financial year 22-23. So I think what you will find is that some of those that are ongoing will probably feature in the action plan at the back of the document as well, because they weren't completed in that financial year and they've been carried forward to 23-24.
Hiya, Karen. Thank you for joining us. I know you haven't been very well.
Thank you.
Wish you get better soon. But I think the point we're making is that we can see that some of them haven't hit their dates. you know, which we'd expect. You can't expect to hit them all, but I think with some of them, if they have got things on them, I think we do have to have an achieved by date given to them, even if they've been brought through. And I think it's something within the report that we need to know where the target date is really for trying to complete them. I think that's what it is. And a lot of them have just ongoing. Whereas perhaps we need to have even, I see some of them have got March 2024 on them. So obviously some of them have been pushed in advance as well, but not all of them. I think we're looking to get rid of the word ongoing and have actually try and fix us to some type of dates, even if it is long term. Even if we have to put 2025 on it, that'll be fine. But as long as they've got some type of time limit on them, I think.
I understand. Thank you, Councillor Rogers. I understand, Chair, the query. We'll take that on board.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Do any other colleagues have any points they want to raise? I mean, it's very pleasing that obviously looking at the evidence, and this is evidence-based, looking at the evidence, the activities show mature to leading. And given this is only the second year, it is very positive. But it's about us being able to, again, understand the background to all these things. I'm not suggesting that we would want necessarily any training on this particular document, but it's maybe us having a greater narrative, I suppose, rather than just being tied to a document which is very complete, but it's not necessarily the easiest to read all the way through. Any other comments from any colleagues? Either my lay colleagues, I don't know, Mark or Helen, if you want to add anything.
That's the only thing I was going to say, and I didn't mention it with the risk register section, but it's just trying to tell the story, isn't it, really, of, what are the sort of KRIs, key risk indicators, which you're looking for, again, if you link it back to this document, to the previous speaker's point, and I totally agree. I've seen it enough in my background that people put ongoing and the action is ongoing, but actually there will tend to be a delivery timeline. It could be 2 years away, but it's actually understanding for us, what are the risks to hitting those deadlines and deliverables, so I think it's just trying to be a little bit punchier perhaps with the wording, and as you say, there's a lot of information. Looks really good, good document. As the chair said, really good progress, but I think just trying to be that little bit more pointed in some of the narrative would be helpful, I think.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to those particular comments. So this particular document was for us to discuss it, to see whether or not we wanted to highlight any points. We've obviously made some observations about how to potentially progress matters, but I don't think we will want to highlight any points to be taken elsewhere at the moment. So cover that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. There is no other there are no other urgent items to discuss, and therefore I call the meeting to a close. And thank you all for attending. For those of us who've travelled to Talbot, I hope you get home safely, because the winds were